morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound in Afghanistan when Dr. Sarah Stalin first arrived at Forward Operating Base Thunder. The dust kicked up by the helicopter blades hadn't even settled when she grabbed her medical bag and headed straight for the field hospital. Around her, hardened soldiers paused their conversations to watch this petite woman in scrubs walk with such determination that even the most seasoned warriors took notice. Sarah had volunteered for this deployment against everyone's advice. Her colleagues at Johns Hopkins had called her crazy. Her parents had pleaded with her to reconsider. Even her commanding officer had suggested she might be better suited for a safer posting. But Sarah knew something they didn't understand yet. She had grown up in a family of firefighters and paramedics, where running toward danger instead of away from it was simply what you did when people needed help. The base was home to some of America's most elite fighting units, including a team of Navy SEALs who had earned legendary status for their courage under fire. These men had completed missions that would make Hollywood screenwriters think twice about believability. They had faced down terrorists in caves, rescued hostages from impossible situations, and walked through gunfire without flinching. Yet something about the quiet intensity of this new doctor made even these battle-hardened warriors curious. Captain Marcus Rodriguez, the SEAL team leader, first met Sarah during a routine medical briefing. She stood barely 5 feet tall, with steady hands that showed no tremor despite being fresh from civilian life. When she spoke about trauma medicine and battlefield surgery, her voice carried the kind of calm authority that comes from someone who has already seen the worst that humans can do to each other. The SEALs listened with respect they rarely showed to anyone outside their brotherhood. During her first week, Sarah treated everything from routine injuries to complex battlefield wounds. She worked 8-hour shifts without complaint, saving lives with a precision that impressed even the veteran medics. The soldiers began to trust her not just with their bodies but with their stories. Late at night, in the medical tent, wounded fighters would tell her about their fears, their families back home, and their dreams for after the war. Sarah quickly learned that this wasn't just any ordinary forward operating base. Intelligence suggested that a major terrorist cell was planning something big in the region. The SEALs were conducting daily reconnaissance missions, trying to locate the enemy before they could strike. Every patrol that went out might not come back complete. Every helicopter that landed might bring casualties that would test every skill Sarah had learned in medical school. But Sarah also noticed something else during those first days. Despite their reputation for fearlessness, even these elite warriors had limits. They would hesitate just slightly before entering certain buildings. They would take extra precautions in areas where chemical weapons might be present. They were brave, but they were also smart enough to be afraid of things that could kill them in ways their training couldn't prevent. The intelligence reports coming in were getting more serious each day. Satellite images showed increased activity at suspected terrorist compounds. Intercepted communications suggested that something was being planned that would require immediate response from the Special Operations Forces. The entire base began operating with the tension that comes when everyone knows a major operation is approaching. Sarah spent her evenings studying the medical protocols for chemical weapons exposure, burns from explosive devices, and mass casualty events. She organized her medical supplies with the methodical care of someone who understood that when the real emergency came, there would be no time to search for what she needed. Her preparation was so thorough that even the experienced combat medics began asking her for advice. The night before everything changed, Sarah sat outside the medical tent, looking up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear desert sky. Captain Rodriguez found her there, unable to sleep himself. They talked quietly about their families, about the reasons they had chosen to serve, about the weight of responsibility they carried for the lives of others. Neither of them knew that in less than 12 hours, everything they thought they knew about courage would be put to the ultimate test. As Sarah finally headed to her bunk that night, she passed the SEAL team, preparing their equipment for another mission. These men who feared nothing were checking and rechecking their gear with the careful attention that had kept them alive. Through countless dangerous operations, their rifles were cleaned to perfection, their tactical equipment arranged with military precision. They nodded respectfully as she passed, recognizing her as someone who understood the seriousness of what they all faced together. The last thing Sarah did before sleeping was to review her emergency medical procedures one more time. She had no idea that tomorrow would bring a crisis that would require her to move beyond everything she had ever been taught, into territory where medical training would matter less than pure human courage. The Flames were coming, and when they arrived, they would test everyone on the base in ways no one could have imagined. The explosion that woke everyone at Forward Operating Base Thunder was unlike anything most of the soldiers had ever experienced. It wasn't the sharp crack of incoming mortar rounds or the distant rumble of aircraft. This was a deep rolling boom that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by a sound like the world's largest campfire, suddenly roaring to life. Sarah was already reaching for her medical bag before her feet hit the ground. Through the small window of her quarters, she could see an orange glow painting the pre-dawn sky. The terrorist cell they had been tracking had finally made their move, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of attacking the base directly, they had targeted the region's main chemical processing facility just 2 miles away. The facility stored industrial chemicals used in legitimate manufacturing, but the terrorists had turned it into a weapon. Their explosives had ruptured multiple storage tanks simultaneously, creating a toxic cloud that was now drifting toward the base on the morning wind. Worse yet, the chemicals had ignited, creating a fire that burned with colors that shouldn't exist in nature and produced smoke that could kill with a single breath. Captain Rodriguez was already coordinating evacuation procedures. When Sarah reached the command center, the entire base had to be moved immediately, but there was a problem that made everyone's blood run cold. A civilian settlement lay directly in the path of the toxic cloud. Nearly 200 people, including dozens of children, were about to be engulfed in a chemical nightmare that would kill them within minutes of exposure. The SEAL team had been trained for many impossible situations, but this scenario pushed beyond the limits of their equipment and tactics. Their standard protective gear wasn't designed for this type of chemical exposure. The masks they carried would provide maybe 10 minutes of protection before the filters became saturated with toxins. Even their legendary courage couldn't overcome basic chemistry and physics. Sarah studied the tactical maps while the evacuation plans took shape around her. The civilian village was accessible by a single road that led directly through the heaviest concentration of the chemical cloud. Any rescue convoy would have to travel nearly 3 miles through air that would kill an unprotected person in less than 5 minutes. The math was simple and terrible. There wasn't enough protective equipment for everyone who would need to go. The discussion in the command center became heated as different options were debated. Some officers argued for waiting until the wind shifted. Others suggested that a helicopter extraction might be possible once the smoke cleared. But Sarah was watching the weather reports and calculating the speed of the advancing toxic cloud. The civilians didn't have time for any of those options. Captain Rodriguez's SEALs were already suiting up in their limited protective gear when Sarah made an observation that changed everything. She had noticed something about the chemical composition of the fire that others had missed. While the smoke was deadly, the flames themselves were consuming the most toxic components. Someone who could get close enough to the actual fire might find cleaner air than in the surrounding areas. This realization led to a plan that was so dangerous it bordered on suicidal. A small team could potentially drive through the edge of the fire zone, where the flames had already burned through the worst of the chemicals, reach the village, and guide the civilians to safety using a route that stayed as close to the actual fires as possible. It was like suggesting they drive through hell to reach the people who needed help. The SEALs looked at each other with expressions that Sarah had never seen on their faces before. These men who had volunteered for every dangerous mission their country had ever asked of them were genuinely afraid. Not afraid of dying, but afraid of dying in a way that their training couldn't help them survive. Chemical weapons didn't care how many push-ups you could do or how accurately you could shoot. They killed based on simple exposure. And no amount of courage could change that fact. Sarah watched as Captain Rodriguez explained why the mission would have to be delayed until better equipment could be brought in. She understood the military logic, but she also understood what that delay would mean for the families huddled In their homes, as the toxic cloud approached their village, time was the one resource no one could provide, and it was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. The meeting was beginning to conclude when Sarah stepped forward and said something that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. She had been thinking about the chemical composition reports, about the wind patterns, and about something her firefighter father had once taught her about different types of dangerous fires. What she was about to propose would require someone to do something that went against every safety protocol ever written. As she began to explain her idea, Sarah could see the SEALs exchanging glances that spoke volumes about what they were thinking. This small doctor was suggesting something that even they considered too dangerous to attempt. But as she continued talking, laying out her reasoning with the calm precision of someone who had thought through every angle, something began to change in their expressions. For the first time since the explosion had awakened the base, someone was offering a plan that might actually save the civilians. It was insane. It was dangerous. It required someone to voluntarily walk into a situation that every rational person would avoid, but it was also the only chance those families had of seeing another sunrise. Sarah finished explaining her proposal and waited for the response. The silence that followed was filled with the distant sound of the chemical fire continuing to burn, and everyone in the room understood that they had very little time left to make the decision that would determine whether they could live with themselves afterward. The explosion that woke everyone at Forward Operating Base Thunder was unlike anything most of the soldiers had ever experienced. It wasn't the sharp crack of incoming mortar rounds or the distant rumble of aircraft. This was a deep rolling boom that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by a sound like the world's largest campfire, suddenly roaring to life. Sarah was already reaching for her medical bag before her feet hit the ground. Through the small window of her quarters, she could see an orange glow painting the pre-dawn sky. The terrorist cell they had been tracking had finally made their move, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of attacking the base directly, they had targeted the region's main chemical processing facility just 2 miles away. The facility stored industrial chemicals used in legitimate manufacturing, but the terrorists had turned it into a weapon. Their explosives had ruptured multiple storage tanks simultaneously, creating a toxic cloud that was now drifting toward the base on the morning wind. Worse yet, the chemicals had ignited, creating a fire that burned with colors that shouldn't exist in nature and produced smoke that could kill with a single breath. Captain Rodriguez was already coordinating evacuation procedures. When Sarah reached the command center, the entire base had to be moved immediately, but there was a problem that made everyone's blood run cold. A civilian settlement lay directly in the path of the toxic cloud. Nearly 200 people, including dozens of children, were about to be engulfed in a chemical nightmare that would kill them within minutes of exposure. The SEAL team had been trained for many impossible situations, but this scenario pushed beyond the limits of their equipment and tactics. Their standard protective gear wasn't designed for this type of chemical exposure. The masks they carried would provide maybe 10 minutes of protection before the filters became saturated with toxins. Even their legendary courage couldn't overcome basic chemistry and physics. Sarah studied the tactical maps while the evacuation plans took shape around her. The civilian village was accessible by a single road that led directly through the heaviest concentration of the chemical cloud. Any rescue convoy would have to travel nearly 3 miles through air that would kill an unprotected person in less than 5 minutes. The math was simple and terrible. There wasn't enough protective equipment for everyone who would need to go. The discussion in the command center became heated as different options were debated. Some officers argued for waiting until the wind shifted. Others suggested that a helicopter extraction might be possible once the smoke cleared. But Sarah was watching the weather reports and calculating the speed of the advancing toxic cloud. The civilians didn't have time for any of those options. Captain Rodriguez's SEALs were already suiting up in their limited protective gear when Sarah made an observation that changed everything. She had noticed something about the chemical composition of the fire that others had missed. While the smoke was deadly, the flames themselves were consuming the most toxic components. Someone who could get close enough to the actual fire might find cleaner air than in the surrounding areas. This realization led to a plan that was so dangerous it bordered on suicidal. A small team could potentially drive through the edge of the fire zone, where the flames had already burned through the worst of the chemicals, reach the village, and guide the civilians to safety using a route that stayed as close to the actual fires as possible. It was like suggesting they drive through hell to reach the people who needed help. The SEALs looked at each other with expressions that Sarah had never seen on their faces before. These men who had volunteered for every dangerous mission their country had ever asked of them were genuinely afraid. Not afraid of dying, but afraid of dying in a way that their training couldn't help them survive. Chemical weapons didn't care how many push-ups you could do or how accurately you could shoot. They killed based on simple exposure. And no amount of courage could change that fact. Sarah watched as Captain Rodriguez explained why the mission would have to be delayed until better equipment could be brought in. She understood the military logic, but she also understood what that delay would mean for the families huddled in their homes as the toxic cloud approached their village. Time was the one resource no one could provide, and it was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. The meeting was beginning to conclude when Sarah stepped forward and said something that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. She had been thinking about the chemical composition reports, about the wind patterns, and about something her firefighter father had once taught her about different types of dangerous fires. What she was about to propose would require someone to do something that went against every safety protocol ever written. As she began to explain her idea, Sarah could see the SEALs exchanging glances that spoke volumes about what they were thinking. This small doctor was suggesting something that even they considered too dangerous to attempt. But as she continued talking, laying out her reasoning with the calm precision of someone who had thought through every angle, something began to change in their expressions. For the first time since the explosion had awakened the base, someone was offering a plan that might actually save the civilians. It was insane. It was dangerous. It required someone to voluntarily walk into a situation that every rational person would avoid, but it was also the only chance those families had of seeing another sunrise. Sarah finished explaining her proposal and waited for the response. The silence that followed was filled with the distant sound of the chemical fire continuing to burn, and everyone in the room understood that they had very little time left to make the decision that would determine whether they could live with themselves afterward. Sarah's plan was deceptively simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. She had realized that the chemical fire was creating its own wind patterns, drawing air toward the flames and then pushing the heated gases upward. This meant that someone traveling in a vehicle could potentially find pockets of cleaner air by staying close to the fire's edge, where the flames were consuming the most toxic elements of the chemical cloud. But the plan required someone to drive a route that no sane person would attempt. The path would take them within 50 feet of flames that burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat alone could kill, even without considering the chemical exposure. The driver would need to navigate by sight through smoke so thick it would be like driving through black paint, relying entirely on the vehicle's thermal imaging system and their own instincts. Captain Rodriguez studied the tactical maps one more time, trying to find any alternative that wouldn't require someone to essentially drive through the fires of hell. But every other route would take too long, and the civilians didn't have time for a safer approach. The toxic cloud was moving faster than anyone had initially calculated. Driven by wind patterns that were being affected by the fire itself, the SEAL team had gathered around their equipment, checking and rechecking their protective gear. Each man carried enough filtered air for maybe 15 minutes of exposure to the chemical environment. After that, they would be breathing the same toxic atmosphere that was already killing plants and animals in its path. Even their legendary training hadn't prepared them for a mission where the environment itself was the primary enemy. Sarah could see the conflict playing out on their faces. These men had never backed down from any challenge, but this situation pushed beyond the boundaries of survivable risk. They were warriors, not chemists. And no amount of physical courage could change the basic facts of chemical exposure and thermal injury. For the first time in their careers, their bodies and equipment weren't enough to overcome the obstacles they faced. The discussion was interrupted by a radio call from the observation post. The toxic cloud had reached the outskirts of the civilian village. People were already beginning to show symptoms of exposure, particularly the elderly and children who were most vulnerable to the chemicals. The local medical clinic was being overwhelmed by patients who couldn't breathe properly, and there were no facilities capable of treating severe chemical poisoning. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She announced that she would drive the route alone, using the base's armored medical vehicle that had been modified with additional air filtration systems. She would reach the village, stabilize as many patients as possible, and guide the strongest civilians back through the same dangerous route she had used to reach. The immediate response from everyone was exactly what she had expected. Captain Rodriguez explained that the plan was suicide, that no one person could navigate that route and provide medical care to hundreds of civilians. The other officers pointed out that she had no training in tactical driving or chemical warfare. Even the medics questioned whether she understood the full implications of what she was proposing. But Sarah had been thinking about more than just the technical aspects of the mission. She had been thinking about the families she had met during her time at the base, the children who had waved to her from the village when she had visited their clinic, and the elderly people who had shared their stories with her during medical checkups. These weren't statistics or tactical considerations to her. They were people whose faces she knew and whose lives mattered more than her own safety. As she began putting on the veiled protective equipment, Sarah explained her reasoning with the same calm authority she used when teaching medical procedures. She was smaller than the SEALs, which meant she would consume less oxygen and could potentially extend the life of her breathing apparatus. Her medical training had taught her to remain calm under extreme pressure, which would be essential for navigating through an environment where panic could be fatal. Most importantly, Sarah had something that even the most elite warriors couldn't provide: the knowledge and equipment needed to treat chemical exposure in the field. If the civilians were going to survive this disaster, they would need immediate medical intervention that only a trained doctor could provide. No amount of tactical expertise could substitute for the ability to counteract chemical poisoning and treat thermal injuries. The SEALs watched as Sarah methodically checked her equipment with the same attention to detail they used when preparing for their most dangerous missions. Her hands were steady as she tested the radio communications, verified the vehicle's filtration systems, and organized her medical supplies for maximum accessibility. There was no hesitation in her movements, no sign that she was having second thoughts about driving into what everyone knew was almost certainly a death trap. Captain Rodriguez made one final attempt to modify the plan. He suggested that one of his men could drive while Sarah provided medical guidance by radio. But Sarah gently explained why that wouldn't work. The chemical environment would interfere with radio communications, and the civilians would need immediate hands-on medical care that couldn't be provided remotely. Whoever went would have to be both driver and doctor, and she was the only person present who was qualified to fill both roles. As Sarah climbed into the driver's seat of the armored medical vehicle, she could see the SEALs standing in formation outside the command center. These men who had never shown fear in the face of any enemy were watching someone, smaller and apparently more fragile than themselves, prepare to attempt something they considered impossible, the last thing Sarah heard before closing the vehicles. Hatch was Captain Rodriguez's voice over the radio. He told her that if anyone could pull off this insane rescue mission, it would be her. But as she started the engine and began driving toward the wall of fire and smoke that blocked her path to the village, Sarah knew that courage alone wouldn't be enough. What she was about to attempt would require a combination of skill, determination, and luck that had never been tested under these conditions. The flames were waiting for her, and soon she would find out whether her plan was brilliant or simply the last decision she would ever make. The first mile of Sarah's drive toward the chemical fire was through familiar territory, but she could already feel the vehicle's air filtration system working harder as the toxic cloud grew thicker. The landscape outside her windows looked like something from another planet. Plants that had been green just hours earlier were now withered and black. The few animals that hadn't fled the area lay motionless beside the road, victims of an invisible killer that showed no mercy. Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the base's observation post. The toxic cloud was spreading faster than computer models had predicted. Driven by the chaotic wind patterns created by the massive chemical fire, the civilian village was now completely engulfed. And thermal imaging showed that people were gathering in the largest buildings, trying to create makeshift shelters that wouldn't provide any real protection against chemical exposure. As she approached the outer edge of the fire zone, Sarah could feel the temperature inside the vehicle beginning to rise despite the air conditioning running at maximum capacity. The flames ahead of her stretched across the entire width of her view, reaching heights that seemed impossible. The fire was feeding on chemicals that burned with unnatural colors, creating a wall of destruction that looked like the entrance to hell itself. Sarah switched to the vehicle's thermal imaging system and immediately understood why the SEALs had hesitated to attempt this route. The heat signature ahead of her showed temperatures that would instantly kill anyone exposed to them. But she also noticed something that confirmed her theory about the fire's behavior. There were cooler corridors within the inferno, places where the flames had already consumed the available fuel and were beginning to burn less. Intensely, the trick would be finding these corridors and staying within them long enough to reach the other side. Sarah would have to navigate using only the thermal imaging display, trusting instruments over her own senses in an environment where human perception could be fatally misleading. She had practiced using similar systems during her medical training for search and rescue operations, but never under conditions where a mistake would result in immediate death. Sarah began her approach to the fire line with the methodical care of a surgeon making a critical incision. She drove slowly, watching the thermal display for any sign that she was moving into dangerous territory. The heat outside was so intense that the vehicle's metal shell was beginning to expand and contract, creating strange popping sounds that made her think the armor might be failing. Under the thermal stress, the moment Sarah entered the fire zone proper, everything changed. The world outside her windows disappeared entirely, replaced by a swirling orange and black chaos that blocked all visibility. The noise was incredible, like being inside a jet engine that was also screaming. The vehicle's systems were being pushed beyond their design limits, with warning lights beginning to flash as various components struggled to function in the extreme environment. Sarah's breathing apparatus was working perfectly, but she could feel the psychological pressure of being surrounded by instant death in every direction. The flames were so close to the vehicle that she could see them reflected in the instruments on her dashboard. One wrong turn, one equipment failure, one moment of panic, and she would become another casualty of the chemical disaster she was trying to help solve. But Sarah's medical training had taught her something invaluable about working under extreme pressure. She had learned to narrow her focus to only the essential information needed for the task at hand. In surgery, this meant ignoring everything except the patient and the instruments. Here, it meant ignoring the flames, the heat, the noise, and the fear, focusing only on the thermal display that would guide her through the inferno, mile by mile. Sarah worked her way through the fire zone using a route that existed only in the temperature differentials shown on her instruments. Several times she had to backtrack when the thermal readings indicated that she was approaching temperatures that would kill her even inside the armored vehicle. The journey that should have taken 15 minutes was taking nearly an hour, and her air supply was running lower than she had hoped. Halfway through the fire zone, Sarah encountered her first major crisis. The thermal imaging system began showing error messages, apparently damaged by the electromagnetic interference created by the chemical fire. She was suddenly driving blind through an environment that would kill her instantly if she made a wrong turn. For several terrifying minutes, she had to navigate using only the sound of the flames and the feeling of heat coming through different parts of the vehicle's armor. Sarah's training as an emergency room doctor proved invaluable during those blind minutes. She had learned to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information, trusting her instincts when technology failed. She guided the vehicle by listening to the intensity of the fire around her, steering away from the loudest roaring and toward areas where the flames sounded less violent. When the thermal system finally came back online, Sarah found that she had somehow stayed within the safe corridor, despite being unable to see where she was going. She was closer to the far edge of the fire zone than she had dared to hope. With enough air supply remaining to complete her mission, But the hardest part was still ahead of her. Reaching the village was only half of the challenge. She would still have to provide medical care to chemical exposure victims, then guide survivors back through the same deadly route she had just traversed, as Sarah finally emerged from the fire zone into the toxic but cooler air on the far side. She could see the civilian village ahead through the chemical haze. Buildings that had housed happy families just that morning were now surrounded by the sickly yellow-green cloud that meant death to anyone who breathed it. She had reached the people who needed her help. But now she faced the real test of whether her impossible plan could actually save lives. The village looked abandoned from a distance. But Sarah's medical training told her that the apparent emptiness was deceiving. The people were there, huddled inside buildings, slowly succumbing to chemical poisoning while hoping for rescue that many of them no longer believed would come. Sarah checked her remaining air supply, organized her medical equipment, and prepared to find out whether one person could make a difference when facing a disaster that had defeated everyone else. Time was running out for the civilians, and Sarah was about to discover whether her journey through the flames would prove to be a rescue mission, or simply a more complicated way of joining the victim she had come to save. Sarah's first view of the village up close was heartbreaking. The chemical cloud had turned the familiar streets into an alien landscape where nothing looked the way it should. The bright colors of the market stalls had faded to sickly yellows and browns. The trees that had provided shade for playing children were now leafless skeletons. Even the air itself seemed thick and wrong. It's like breathing through wet cloth. But Sarah could see signs of life in the largest community building at the center of the village. Thermal imaging showed dozens of people clustered together inside, their body heat creating bright spots on her display. She drove as close as possible to the building, then faced the moment she had been dreading. She would have to leave the safety of her vehicle and enter the toxic environment that was slowly killing everyone around her. Sarah's protective equipment included the most advanced breathing apparatus available to military medical personnel. But she knew it would only provide about 20 minutes of clean air in this level of chemical contamination. 20 minutes to assess dozens of patients, provide emergency treatment, organize an evacuation, and somehow convince terrified people to follow her back through a wall of fire that they could see burning in the distance the moment Sarah stepped out of her vehicle. She understood why even the SEALs had hesitated to attempt this mission. The chemical environment wasn't just dangerous. It was actively hostile in ways that her training hadn't fully prepared her for. The air seemed to burn her exposed skin even through her protective suit. Every breath required conscious effort, and she could feel her body's natural warning systems screaming at her to retreat to safety. But Sarah had learned during her medical residency that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. She had worked in emergency rooms where making the wrong decision meant watching people die who might have been saved. This situation was simply a larger version of the same ethical challenge. People were dying. She had the skills to help them. Personal safety couldn't be her primary consideration. Sarah entered the community building to find a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Nearly 200 civilians, including dozens of children, were crowded into a space designed for maybe 50 people. The chemical exposure was affecting people differently based on their age, its health, and how long they had been breathing the contaminated air. Some were unconscious. Others were struggling to breathe. Many were caring for family members who were clearly dying. The village elder, a man named Ahmad, who Sarah had met during her previous medical visits, recognized her despite her protective equipment. His relief at seeing someone from the outside world was visible even through his own symptoms of chemical poisoning. He had been trying to keep everyone calm while watching his neighbors slowly succumb to an enemy they couldn't fight or even see. Clearly, Sarah immediately began triaging patients. Using a system she had learned for mass casualty events, the most severely affected individuals needed immediate intervention or they would die within minutes. Those with moderate symptoms could survive long enough to be evacuated if they received basic treatment. The people with minimal exposure might be able to walk out on their own if they had proper protection from further contamination, working with an efficiency that impressed even herself. Sarah began administering antidotes for chemical poisoning from her medical supplies. She had prepared for this possibility by researching the specific chemicals involved in the fire and bringing the appropriate medications. But she had only brought enough medicine for maybe 30 people. She was looking at nearly 200 potential patients. Sarah made decisions that no medical textbook had taught her how to make. She gave full doses of antidotes to the patients who were most likely to survive with treatment, smaller doses to those who might benefit from partial protection, and focused on comfort care for individuals who were too far gone to save. It was battlefield medicine taken to an extreme that pushed beyond normal ethical boundaries as she worked. Sarah explained her evacuation plan to Ahmad and the other village leaders. They would have to leave most of their possessions behind and travel in groups small enough to fit in her vehicle. The strongest adults would go first, carrying the sickest children. Each trip through the fire zone would take over an hour, and she would need to make at least 6 round trips to evacuate everyone who could survive the journey. The village leaders understood immediately why Sarah's plan was both their only hope and almost certainly impossible. Even if she could somehow make multiple trips through the chemical fire without her vehicle failing or her own protective equipment breaking down, many of the patients were too sick to survive the journey. They would be asking her to choose who lived and who died based on her assessment of their chances. Sarah spent precious minutes explaining why some people couldn't be moved. The elderly villagers with severe respiratory damage would die during the journey, even if everything went perfectly. Parents with young children who were unconscious from chemical exposure would have to choose whether to stay with their sickest family members or try to save the ones who might survive. These were decisions that no one should have to make. But the chemical fire had created a situation where normal rules no longer applied. As Sarah prepared for her first evacuation trip, she could see the understanding in the eyes of the people who knew they wouldn't be chosen for rescue. These villagers faced their situation with a dignity that made her heart break. They helped identify which children had the best chance of survival, which adults were strong enough to help during the evacuation, and which patients needed immediate medical attention during transport. Ahmad pressed something into Sarah's hand as she prepared to leave with the first group of evacuees. It was a small wooden carving that his grandson had made, a gift for the doctor who had come back for them when everyone else had given up. He told her that whether she succeeded or failed, she had given them something more valuable than rescue. She had proven that they mattered enough for someone to risk everything to try to save them. Sarah looked around the community building one more time before leading the first group toward her vehicle. She was about to attempt something that defied logic, training, and common sense. She would try to save as many people as possible by making multiple trips through a fire that had already nearly killed her once. The flames were still burning, her equipment was already damaged, and time was running out for everyone who remained behind. But as Sarah helped the first group of survivors into her vehicle, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Despite the impossible circumstances, despite the mathematical probability that most of these people would die regardless of her efforts, she felt hope. Not hope that everything would work out perfectly, but hope that sometimes one person really could make a difference when it mattered most. By Sarah's 4th trip back to the village, her repeated journeys through the chemical fire had created something unexpected. Word of her rescue mission had spread throughout the entire military command structure, reaching generals who normally dealt with strategic planning rather than individual operations. Satellite feeds showing her impossible route through the flames were being watched by officers who had spent decades evaluating what was tactically possible under extreme conditions. Captain Rodriguez received orders that surprised even him. His SEAL team was being reassigned to support Sarah's rescue operation in any way possible. Despite their earlier assessment that the mission was beyond their capabilities, the reasoning was simple. If one person could accomplish what she was doing, then the military's understanding of acceptable risk levels needed to be completely reconsidered. But when the SEALs arrived at the staging area to assist Sarah, they found something that challenged everything they thought they knew about courage under fire. She was preparing for another trip through the flames using equipment that any rational person would have declared inoperable. Her protective suit had been patched with medical tape. Her vehicle's air filtration system was running on backup power. The thermal shielding that protected her from the chemical fire had been compromised in so many places that it looked like it had been through a war zone. Sarah was also showing physical signs of the toll her rescue mission was taking. Multiple exposures to chemical contamination were causing symptoms that she was treating with medications from her own medical supplies. The extreme heat from repeated passages through the fire zone had caused burns on her hands and arms. Despite her protective equipment, most concerning, her oxygen consumption had increased dramatically as her body worked harder to cope with the toxic environment. Yet Sarah was preparing for her 5th trip back to the village with the same methodical care she had shown during her first rescue run. She was checking her equipment, organizing her medical supplies, reviewing the thermal imaging data from her previous journeys. To the SEALs watching her, it looked like someone preparing for a routine mission rather than someone attempting something that defied every principle of survival and safety. Captain Rodriguez made one final attempt to convince Sarah to let his team take over the rescue operation. His men had been studying her route through the fire zone, and they believed they could continue the evacuations using their own equipment and training. But Sarah's response revealed something about her mission that the SEALs hadn't fully understood. The people still trapped in the village weren't just waiting for rescue. Many of them were dying from chemical poisoning that required immediate medical intervention during transport. Others had injuries from the chemical explosion that needed constant monitoring to prevent fatal complications. The rescue wasn't just about driving through dangerous terrain. It was about providing emergency medical care under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced trauma. Dr. Sarah's 5th trip to the village brought her face-to-face with the hardest decisions of the entire rescue operation. The people remaining in the community building included patients who were too sick to survive the journey, families who refused to leave elderly relatives behind, and children whose parents had already been evacuated but who were now too weak from chemical exposure to travel safely, working with supplies that were running dangerously low. Sarah performed medical miracles that saved lives under conditions that seemed designed to make healing impossible. She stabilized patients whose symptoms suggested they should already be dead. She convinced families to make choices that violated every cultural norm about caring for elderly relatives. She carried children who weighed almost as much as she did, using strength that came from sources beyond physical training during her 6th trip through the fire zone. Sarah's vehicle finally began failing in ways that couldn't be repaired or ignored. The air filtration system developed a leak that allowed toxic gases to enter the passenger compartment. The thermal shielding failed completely in several areas, requiring her to navigate around heat sources that would have killed everyone inside. The communication system stopped working, cutting her off from the base support that had been monitoring her progress. But Sarah continued. The rescue operation using equipment held together by determination and medical tape. Guided by an understanding of the fire zone that had been earned through repeated exposure to conditions that should have killed her, she was operating beyond the boundaries of what training could prepare someone for. In territory where success depended on instincts developed through experiences that no simulation could replicate. By the time Sarah completed her final evacuation run, she had rescued 163 people from certain death, including 42 children and 28 elderly villagers who would never have survived without immediate medical intervention. She had made 8 trips through a chemical fire that military experts had declared impassable, using equipment that had failed in every way except the most essential ones. When Sarah finally emerged from the fire zone for the last time, her vehicle was so damaged that it died within sight of the military base. She had to be carried to the medical facility, suffering from chemical exposure, thermal burns, and exhaustion that went beyond anything in medical literature. But she was conscious enough to ask about the condition of every person she had rescued, reviewing their treatment plans with the same attention to detail she had shown throughout the entire impossible mission. The SEALs who had initially hesitated to attempt the rescue mission found themselves part of a support team for someone who had accomplished something that redefined their understanding of courage under fire. These men who had built their careers on doing things that others considered impossible had watched a small doctor do something that even they had thought was beyond human capability. Captain Rodriguez visited Sarah In the base hospital 3 days after her final rescue run, he told her something that stayed with her for the rest of her life, that his team had learned more about real courage from watching her mission than they had learned in years of the most dangerous military operations. She had shown them that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons and tactics, but with the simple refusal to accept that some people can't be saved. The chemical fire eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The terrorist attack had achieved its goal of creating destruction and chaos, but it had also revealed something that the attackers hadn't anticipated. When faced with a disaster designed to demonstrate human helplessness, one person had proven that individual courage could overcome circumstances that seemed beyond any possibility of resistance. Sarah returned to her medical practice after completing her military deployment, but she never forgot the lessons learned during those 8 trips through the chemical fire. She had discovered that the most important medical equipment isn't found in any hospital. Sometimes healing requires nothing more sophisticated than the willingness to go where others won't go, to help people that others have given up on, and to keep trying when every rational analysis suggests that further effort is pointless. The IBH that Sarah had saved was eventually rebuilt in a safer location, but the community never forgot the doctor who had driven through hell to reach them when they needed help most. They named their new medical clinic after her. It's not because she had performed medical miracles, but because she had demonstrated something more important than technical expertise. She had shown that sometimes one person really can make a difference when it matters most, even when the odds are impossible and the cost is almost too high to bear.